I request Dr. Sean Grish to speak to us. Dr. Sean actually is the founder and director of the Critical Institute. He's also the editor-in-chief of International Journal Disability and the Global South, and the co-editor of the book series Palgrave Studies in Disability and International Development. Sean is now the honorary associate professor at the University of Cape Town and senior academic consultant, Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction, CBM.
What I'll be doing over the next 10 minutes is actually, I think, confuse things a bit more by raising a series of questions. I don't have indicators or guidelines or solutions. I have some critical reflections. I come from critical disability studies, in particular around the research that we do and how we do it. And in particular, I respond to three critical issues. The first one is that we in fact lack critical qualitative research on the disability and poverty relationship. And we also lack, importantly, interdisciplinary theory. The second one is that I would dare say that the serious issues we confront are not whether persons with disabilities are poorer or by how much, or how to go about measuring this poverty. We do have a good enough sense of that. It is instead the attempt to quantify, simplify, and generalize which preoccupies me. Because what happens that when the data that we generate meets the uncontainment of the human narrative of disability, of life. And the third issue is that, and where I think we face the biggest problem of all, is that research that we do is too often depoliticized. The drive and money for many are the methods and manageable data, but too few want to engage with the historical, geopolitical, and the power asymmetries that cause this poverty and inequality in the first place and that maintain it. So in this presentation, I will be confusing things a bit more. The premise in this presentation is very simple, that poverty cannot slip out of focus. And by this, I do not mean in terms of measurement or crunching of numbers, but in terms of understanding poverty in its full contextualized, dynamic complexity and the changing nature of this across different spaces and places. Because people do articulate their own poverty in their own space on their own terms, using their own methods. But do we often listen? And whose methods count? And contending with local positioned understandings of poverty is critical because ultimately disability is created, framed, and also lived and survived within context. Disability, to use Leonard Davis's words, takes shape in the context of the hegemony of the norm. And what I have termed the spaces of poverty, spaces that are as material as they are discursive and ontological. More basically, I feel that we need an in-depth understanding of what life in poverty is like for everyone, irrespective of disability, as the epistemological starting point, because even the meaning of disability changes with these dynamic forces. And in fact, much of my work on disability and poverty over the past 20 years in Guatemala has involved no more and no less than trying to understand what life is like in poverty at the most micro level and starting over again. And every time understanding that I actually know very little and that I can capture very little of it with such succinct, almost numerical precision. Because no space is like another, however much we try to think otherwise, including within a single country or region. So in fact, much of my work is about understanding livelihoods and survival that are very often hard and premised on hard physical labor with temporal changes. So questions raised are, how do different disabled bodies face up to or even resist this across, for example, the agricultural cycle? Fragmented or no social protection, informal labor that is erratic. It also means understanding cultural framings of personhood, including disability, vulnerability, stresses and shocks, landlessness, political invisibility and indifference, because let's face it, national policies are very often worth very little in local contexts where there is little political commitment or budget. In many instances, they are not even known at the local level. lack of social capital, because once again, let's face it, it's not the policies written on paper that enable people to survive, but who you know. Inequality and the problem of politics that are subservient to the wills of the oligarchy, racism, intergenerational poverty, and importantly, disabled families. The second point is the heterogeneity of disability, because disability and its meaning are far from homogeneous, especially because disability is framed within context, including local constructions of personhood, and as it meets different circumstances. So what does it mean to be a full person in a particular space and a particular time? And how do different people with disabilities face up to, confront, and even challenge these? How does poverty and how it is experienced shift? Are people equally poor across time, and do they need different supports? What does it really mean to be disabled, and does it change? In fact, Rosemary Garland Thompson usefully reminds us of the complex subjectivities that can, let's face it, hardly be measured. So if people are differently disabled and poor at different times, do we actually know what we are measuring? What about dimensions such as pain that cannot actually, or that cannot be quite quantified, if at all? So heterogeneity means contending with a range of intersecting, or rather an intersectional issues, such as a type of impairment, visibility of impairment vis-a-vis cultural notions, religious and spiritual dimensions, race, ethnicity, gender dimensions, citizenship. To what extent can people claim their rights on paper when these are often bound to citizenship? What about disabled migrants and refugees? Are they even considered in research with an ableist view of migrant bodies? What does this mean? We cannot quite understand poverty and context without openness to multiple interacting and changing vectors of impoverishment and oppression. And the point here is perhaps the most important. We do measure poverty to bring disability into the fold of poverty reduction, of mainstream development. But one thing we scarcely acknowledge is that poverty, as with development, has strong historical roots that are far from benign and are often grounded in the colonial encounter. In fact, Philip McMichael documents how colonialism was the birth of capitalism and development as we know them, an instrument operating in a dynamic of contemporaneous destruction and the bid to cure to maintain order in the machine. We need to adopt a historical approach, including in our research, because as Tuhi Y. Smith reminds us, history is mostly about power. It is the story of the powerful and how they became powerful. Acknowledging that poverty is multidimensional is hardly enough. Neither is the recognition that disability increases the risk of multidimensional poverty. How about understanding neo-colonial oppression, unequal geopolitical power relationships, the politics of containment, and the emphasis on strong productive bodies in the neoliberal narrative, which in fact make disabled bodies perpetually problematic, unfitting, almost designed for perpetual poverty? How about devoting time to understanding the factors that give rise to and maintain this multidimensional poverty in the first place, including climate change? Because let's face it, if there is one common factor in the hugely complex and heterogeneous global South space that we often try to generalize in numbers, is a history of colonialism and also of coloniality. And within this space, how do people frame and face foreign research and also intervention within this historical and geopolitical baggage? How does this, in fact, impact the data that we yield? We need to pose some important questions, and starting off with inclusion into what? Is it necessarily good to include persons with disabilities in development, a development that itself can be disabled? Because let's face it, development in its neoliberal form continues to dominate, including cuts in social expenditure, to privatization of key sectors, including healthcare and education. The poor are always those who disproportionately suffer the brunt of so-called progress, including measures claiming to reduce poverty, when this is inevitably without redistribution, without disrupting the powerful elite that control resources, politicians, and also politics.
You have the last couple of minutes. Sure.
Okay, thank you. So how does disability confront this ableist development that can be so inimical to well-being and inclusion, and perhaps even disabling? It is fair to say that the neoliberal agenda runs counter to inclusive development because the cost cutting does not quite align with the provision of resources that are actually needed to include persons with disabilities, implement their rights, and reduce their poverty. What value will rights and legislation have if the resources to implement and enforce them are absent? Poor countries often remain sources of profit repatriation to rich countries. Importantly, it is no secret that so many activities in the name of development, be they mining, sweatshops, or sorting of technological waste, are a major source of injury and impairment. And the message here is simple. We need to move beyond uncritical celebration of poverty reduction policies, declarations, and discourses, and also research. We need to politicize our discourses and activism, as well as our research now more than ever. And I will round off here. So the message overall is quite simple. We urgently need to decolonize discourse and research. Let's move beyond simplifications, generalizations, to be open to understanding disability and poverty in their full and dynamic complexity and heterogeneity. To be clear, this is not some detached academic exercise. But what does this all mean? We need to step back, listen, and learn. We can agree here that we all want the same thing, but we have different ways and ideas of how to go about it or how to measure it. Just because we want what is best does not mean that we know what is best for them. Asking people to participate in a process that, let's face it, has done very little for them means there are justifiably trust issues to contend with. They also have different priorities, survival, and these will not be resolved by sending a researcher from the same country or claiming representation because we involve some or other DPO. We need dialogue, debate, collaboration, and we need humility. And we need to prioritize and privilege the demands and methodologies of those living in poverty and researchers from the Global South, how they want to talk about and research their own poverty. We need to complexify before simplifying. But to do this, we need to decolonize not only research and practices, but also ourselves. And to use Tiongo's words, perhaps we need to decolonize our own minds and our practices. Thank you.